Y'all doing good this morning? Good, good. You know, this weekend, Leanne and I celebrated our 28th wedding anniversary. Thank you. Something that I think is sort of a humorous footnote on this, when I'd called earlier in the week to order some flowers, being the romantic man that I am, and the florist on the other end's like, well, how many years is it? And I said, 28 years of marriage. And then I threw out that, cliche line like, yeah, we got married when we were 10. But then I did the math and I realized if you get married when you're 10 and you've been married 28 years, you're still old. It doesn't even help to say that anymore. It's like, we got married when we were 1. That it didn't even make you younger to lie anymore. So that was a realization. It's not a good one. Well, anyway, let's get down to business here. It was not really in Carol's mind that day to completely destroy her family. But that is exactly what Carol did. She destroyed her family. In fact, Carol destroyed another person's family as well. And it all began when Carol just simply hit the friend request button on the Facebook page of an old flame. Carol had actually hesitated a moment before she clicked that button because somewhere deep down inside a voice was saying, "Stop! Don't do it." But Carol silenced that voice with one final, "Oh, it's nothing. It's nothing." And she blew right through that flashing red light in her conscience. Click. Click. And before long, a whole series of flashing red lights toppled before Carol like a line of dominoes. And long before Carol's brain caught up with the buzz, that simple little ad as a friend had become a full-blown affair. And in time, the full-blown affair had become 2 fully blown-up families. Anybody know a story or two like that? Yeah. Anybody know a Carol or two, or a Carl or two, right? Statistically speaking, mind you, there's a Carol or a Carl or two in this room right now. Somebody who is maybe even at this very moment in your life, you're silencing voices that are trying to stop you from blowing through some flashing red lights in your brain like a string of dominoes. And you're completely ignoring those voices. You're completely ignoring those flashing red lights. Well, here's the truth. Actually, we're all in danger. Every single one of us is in danger of being or becoming a Carol or a Carl. Some of you have heard me say before that I have a surefire test for figuring out if you're in danger for this sort of thing to happen in your life. And this is the surefire test. You can do this with me. Hold out these 2 fingers like this. You can do this, yeah. Put it across your carotid artery. Do you feel a pulse? If so, you are in danger of ending up in bed with someone you're not married to. All right? And that is the bottom line this morning. Not ending up in bed with someone you're not married to is the big idea behind commandment number 7. As we continue this week in our ongoing Live the 10 message series, which is a look at the 10 commandments. Commandment number 7, which is found in Exodus 20:14, simply reads, "You shall not commit adultery." It's a very, very simple command. It's actually only 2 words in the original Hebrew language. The 2 words would translate, "Don't adulterize." It's a verb form of adultery. Don't adulterize. And so here's the big idea. Life goes well for us, and life goes well for people around us when we don't sleep with people that we're not married to, when we don't end up in bed with people we're not married to. Now, each week of this series, I've introduced the commandment of the week with this particular truth, that life goes well for us and life goes well for people around us when we do life God's way, when we obey His commands. And we saw this truth, and we've seen this foundational truth each week in Deuteronomy 12:28, which reads, As the Lord speaking to us, he says, be careful to obey all my commands so that all will go well with you and your children after you, because you will be doing what is good and pleasing to the Lord your God. And so when we choose to live the 10, when we choose to do life God's way, life goes well for us, and life goes well for our children after us. Life goes well for people all around us. And why does it go well? Because we're doing what is good and pleasing to the Lord. And it is good and pleasing to the Lord, number 7 tells us, when we stay out of bed with people we're not married to. Plain and simple. And that's the big idea behind number 7 that we're going to begin to work with this morning. So let's read this next slide together. Life goes well when I don't sleep with people I'm not married to. We need a little like bouncing ball thing, you know how the follow the magic bouncing ball. Let's read that again. Life goes well when I don't sleep with people I'm not married to. Now, just like a couple weeks ago, I'm not entirely satisfied with this particular phraseology because we're going to see this morning that there's more to number 7 than God just merely saying to us, you know, don't have sexual intercourse outside of marriage. There's more to number 7 than just this strict definition. And if we reduce number 7 to this, you know, strict lawyer-like definition, you know, then there might be a number of us who might be able to say, hey, you can check number 7 off the list for me. Because honestly, you know, ending up in bed with somebody I'm not married to, it's not an ongoing issue in my life. Right? So it might be easy for some of us to check number 7 off the list. But this morning, what I want you to see is that number 7 probably is an ongoing issue in the lives of most of us in one way or another. And why? It's the carotid artery thing. We're going to see this morning that God's heart behind number 7 just encompasses way more than merely what's happening in a bed somewhere. Okay? That's what we're going to see. And so given the assumption that everyone has a pulse in their carotid artery, anybody not feel a pulse? We're all good. I was going to say, you've got bigger problems than adultery if you don't, at this moment at least, if you don't have a pulse. But given the assumption that we all have a pulse, then we're all at risk. We're all at risk of violating what God said is a good and pleasing thing to do here in number 7. And so we all need to understand, well, how do we live number 7? How do we live number 7? So here's the first choice that we need to make to live number 7. We need to maintain God's standards. We need to maintain God's standards. When it comes to expressing our God-given sexuality, which is a good thing, but when it comes to expressing our God-given sexuality, we need to draw the lines where God draws the lines. And God's standard begins right here in Exodus 20 with, don't sleep with people you're not married to. And that's just the beginning point. Now, I got to admit, it almost seems silly to say things like this because, you know, this sort of, you know, these sorts of instructions are just so out of date. You know what I'm saying? Do you know what I'm saying? It's so countercultural. God's standards are so antiquated. They're so not with the times. And unfortunately, I think it's even true that within the pews of the church, God's standards for sexual purity sound so silly. But we need to draw the lines where God draws the lines. God says to us, you know what, life goes better when you don't sleep with people you're not married to. But our culture tells us over and over again in a plethora of ways, every single day, the exact opposite message. Life goes better when you sleep around a lot. Isn't that what our culture says? And unfortunately, that cultural stance against unconstrained expression of our sexuality has crept into the lifestyles of those who claim to be Christ followers. People who profess to be doing life God's way, though they're completely dismissing doing life God's way, at least in their sexuality. Does that make sense? So whether it's inside the church, whether it's outside the walls of the church, this is what we do. This is how this works. We try to wiggle our way around God's lines in the sands. We try to wiggle our way around number 7 by erasing the lines that God has drawn and kind of, drawing new lines in the sands, that whatever works for us. And so this is one of those deals where if I had a nickel for every time as a pastor I have heard these sorts of line gerrymandering. Remember the old phrase gerrymandering, just redrawing the lines where it's convenient for you? So it's like, well, we plan on getting married someday, and so it's okay. Right? Well, we're virtually married. We're in love. We're committed to one another. A legal piece of paper doesn't really change anything about what's true in our relationship. Right? Well, technically, we're not sleeping together. You heard that one? Maybe tried that one? Right? Technically, we're not committing adultery in the strictest sense of the word, right? There's all sorts of gerrymandering we do to try to wiggle our ways around the lines, and our justifications for our sexual immorality sound as ridiculously hollow before the Lord as, you have to go here, Bill Clinton's famous, I am not having sex with that woman. That woman that he was, in fact, having sex with, right? I'm not. And he justified it in his own mind. He justified his perjury, with the defense, well, I guess that depends on what your definition of is. Somebody remember that? All right, just... Right? So my point is, we need to draw the lines in the sand on number 7, we do draw the lines in the sand on number 7 in just about any place that's convenient for the sexual lifestyle that we want to live. But the important question that we need to ask is, well, where does God draw the line? If we're called as Christ's followers to maintain God's standards for sexual purity, then we need to draw the lines where God draws the lines. And so where does he draw those lines? Well, Jesus gives us the answer to this question in his rabbinic commentary on number 7. We've seen in previous weeks that in Matthew 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives this ongoing commentary on the 10 Commandments. And on number 7, this is what Jesus has to say. Well, you have heard the commandment that says, you must not commit adultery, but I say, this is such a fascinating thing that Jesus does here. He's trumping Moses. See what he's doing? He's saying, the 10 Commandments, Moses said, don't commit adultery, but I say, Moses, I'm saying, you see what he's doing there? See the difference? See, me, Moses, never mind. So, I say to you, Jesus says, he's trumping the commandment, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So as we've seen in previous weeks, that Jesus' commentary, explains for us the Father's heart behind the 10 Commandments. And when we see the Father's heart behind the 10 Commandments, we see that the line gets drawn at a much deeper level in the sand than just merely our behaviors. He really goes after our hearts. And here Jesus tells us that adultery begins not in bed, but where? In our heads. Adultery doesn't begin in bed, adultery begins in our heads. Anyone who even turns over a lustful thought in his or her head for someone that he or she is not even married to, Jesus says, they've already broken number 7. They've already broken number 7. So where does God draw the line for sexual purity? He draws it in our heads. All right, so now by Jesus' definition, I won't ask for a show of hands. Any adulterers in the room? All right, I'll admit it. So Jesus' standard for sexual purity, really, it settles this whole issue of gerrymandering. It settles this whole issue of Bill Clintoning the lines of morality. Well, how far I go with someone I'm not married to all depends on my definition of is. Jesus says, no, I've drawn a line in the sand in your head, right? And it has nothing to do with the definition of is. I'll never forget leading a Bible study in the fraternity that Sheldon and I were both in, where we met in college. And one particular night, the question came up from the guys in the Bible study. It's like, well, Kent, they called me Butch. Butch, how far can we go with our girlfriends? And it was a little bit of a distressing night because they started walking around the bases. Do they talk about the bases anymore? First base, second base. But they were like asking very specific questions, like on each step between the bases. Can we, if we round first and do this, can we do that, Butch? And if second, and what if we round third base and we take this step? Is that okay with God? Have we crossed the line? It was an interesting evening. It was certainly memorable. So in search for an answer to the question, where does God draw the line for sexual purity, they were most interested in trying to figure out how far they could keep going. By managing the bases, by managing their behaviors. But Jesus says that sexual purity begins way back in our brains, not just in our behaviors. Not just in our behaviors. We're caught up in trying to justify whether or not we're technically in bed with somebody. And Jesus is saying to us, whoa, you crossed the line with number 7, not just in what happened between the sheets just now, but you crossed the line with number 7 way back in what happened between your ears. Way back there. And so to maintain God's standards, to live number 7, we need to manage our minds. We need to manage our minds. Why? Because the Lord draws the lines of sexual purity in our thoughts, way back in our heads. All right? Makes sense? Clear enough. And listen, Jesus' definition of sexual purity doesn't even stop in our heads. In Jesus' words, we also see that he draws the line of sexual purity in our hearts as well. Let's read the passage again. Verse 27, you have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery, but I say anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. In his heart. Underline the words adultery with her in his heart. Adultery in his heart. All right, now listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. It's crystal clear from Jesus' teaching right here that there is such a thing as non-sexual adultery in the heart. Did you hear that? Jesus says it right here that there is non-sexual adultery in the heart. Jesus says, yes, there is such thing as emotional adultery, and emotional adultery is adultery. Do you hear that? There's a lot of popular debate whether it's cheating or not to become just merely emotionally involved with someone you're not married to. Jesus? Yep, it's adultery. It's adultery. But we're not sleeping together. Well, you're not having sexual intercourse, but you're having emotional intercourse, says Jesus. And emotional intercourse with someone you're not married to is adultery. So says Jesus right here in Matthew 5. So quit doing one of these. It's adultery. All right, clear? Does that make sense? In fact, Jesus' words here even take us a step further than emotional involvement with someone not married to. Jesus goes on to put his finger on not just the feelings that are in our hearts, but the motives that are in our hearts. Jesus is going after the motives also in these words. Now, this is a bit of a technical point, so put your thinking cap on and track with me a little bit. But you can read in Bible commentaries that the words "with her" in this last sentence are peculiar words. I mean, listen to this. Jesus says to you, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, it would have made more sense if Jesus would have said, but I say anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. Why would Jesus put these words with her in his heart? Because it doesn't make sense. Do you understand why that does not make sense? All right, let me explain. Because, they're peculiar because if a man is lusting after a woman in his head, all right, then the sin should be entirely his own sin, right? She's not even conscious of what's going on, let alone is she a willing participant in what's going on in the luster's lust. So why would Jesus implicate the woman by saying that the luster has already committed adultery with her in his heart, as if she had participated? All right, that's the scholarly question that commentators are having to wrestle with. And scholars and commentators have convincingly demonstrated, and you can check out the commentaries on this if you don't trust me, but they say the words with her make sense that if this is what Jesus actually meant. Jesus is saying anyone who even looks at a woman with lust towards the end of securing that person's lust in return has already committed adultery with her by virtue of eliciting that kind of response. All right, so again, check out commentators if you don't trust me on that, but it's there. So you understand it? If somebody is having the thoughts and they're relating to another person in such a way that they're trying to pull those same thoughts out of them, Jesus is saying, all right, that's adultery with that person. That is adultery with that person. All right, so here's the implication then of what Jesus is saying. He's saying that adultery doesn't happen merely in bed, and adultery doesn't extend to just merely our thoughts, what's going on in our heads, but adultery does take place in our hearts, not only in our emotions, but in our motives. Adultery happens in the motive of fishing for another person's lust. And so Jesus is here saying to us, hey, if I'm giving that look to someone that I'm not married to in order to fish for their lust, I've crossed the line that he drew in the sand. Right? If I'm saying the things that I'm saying, I'm saying the words that I'm saying, I'm telling the jokes that I'm telling in order to fish for another person's lust that I'm not married to, Jesus says, well, that's a motive of the heart, and that's adultery. Jesus says to us, if I'm wearing the things I'm wearing in order to fish for the lust of somebody that I'm not married to, I've crossed the line. Do you understand that? If anyone even thinks about another person in such a way that we're trying to pull the lust out of them in return, I have already committed adultery with that person in the motives of my heart. And see, we get caught up in trying to erase the lines and renegotiate the mechanics of what we're doing, if the mechanics actually constitute adultery. And Jesus is saying to us, whoa, you crossed the line of number 7, not in the mechanics of what's happening, but way back in the motives. Way back there, you cross the lines of number 7. And so to live number 7, church, as Christ followers, to live number 7, we need to manage our minds. We need to monitor our emotions. We need to monitor our motives, because the Lord draws the lines of sexual purity in our heads, and he draws the lines of sexual purity in our hearts. And we need to maintain or draw the lines of sexual purity where the Lord draws the lines. So we need to maintain God's standard. That's the first point. Here's the second choice. The second choice that Jesus would have us live to make have us choose to live number 7 is choose radical severance. Isn't that a fun picture? Some of you are worried, where is he going with this? Where's Jesus going with this? Choose radical severance. Can't go there. Not going to go there. Stop. All right. We see this as if we continue with Jesus' teaching here in Matthew 25. So after saying, hey, it's in the head, it's in the heart, he goes on to say, so if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, Gouge it out and throw it away, says Jesus. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. That's logical. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And so Jesus is proposing here some pretty radical measures for living number 7, right? Measures that I'm calling radical severance. Radical severance. Jesus says, hey, if your eye is causing you trouble, poke it out. If your hand is getting you in trouble, hack it off. Radical severance. Sever any part of your body that's pulling you across the lines in the sand of sexual purity that the Lord has drawn. Pretty radical, right? All right, now if Jesus really teaches this, and he seems to, right? Why is it that we don't run into, more one-eyed Christians named Lefty? Right? I mean, if it's a carotid artery thing, I think everybody should be one-eyed Christian named Lefty. I actually had somebody tell me one time that they thought all Christians were a bunch of hypocrites because he didn't know of one single Christian who obeyed Jesus' teaching right here in Matthew 5. And he suspected, I think there are probably a couple Christians who struggle with lust, but I don't know any one-handed, one-eyed Christians. You're all a bunch of hypocrites. Well, the important question is this: does Jesus here command his followers? Does Jesus here command us to literally start hacking off our problematic body parts? Is that what Jesus is really saying? I say to you, and I'm not trumping Jesus here, I'm not redrawing lines now, I'm just saying, no, that's not what Jesus is saying here. Whew. Yeah. Well, why do I say that? Listen, we just saw, now listen to this carefully. In verses 27 and 28, Jesus tells us, he already told us, that our problem with lust doesn't, it's not in our eyes, it's not in our hands. Where is our problem with lust? It's our brains, it's in our hearts. And so if Jesus is here commanding us to literally start hacking away at the problematic areas in our bodies, he'd have us begin where? Right? Does it make sense? Yeah. And, and while that would actually probably put a definitive end to our struggles with lust, Jesus was not really advocating sexual purity through suicide. Or even that matter, Jesus is not advocating sexual purity through self-mutilation. Right? I mean, let's face it, men. Let's be honest here. We could whittle away our bodies down to next to nothing, and as long as the brain was still working, we could go there, couldn't we? Men, the honest answer is yes. Women, what is the honest answer men should be giving? Yeah, okay. All right, we're busted. All right. Jesus here is not commanding us to maintain sexual purity through self-mutilation. Instead, he's actually just illustrating for us the choice of radical severance, the choice of radically cutting off, whatever it is that's feeding the lusts in our head, whatever it is that's feeding the lusts in our hearts. Jesus said, cut it off, radically sever whatever that is. Oh, Jesus, I keep seeing things on TV that are feeding my thought life. Oh, why don't you pull the plug? Pull the plug on my TV? That's just crazy talk. No, says Jesus, it's better to pull the plug on your TV than, let's say, burn in hell, for instance. Just as an example. Hell is crazy. Hell is crazy, says Jesus. I can't do that. Right? Jesus, I just keep ending up on porn sites on the internet. I can't stop ending up on porn sites. Why don't you pull the plug on your internet? What? I can't live without internet? Jesus says, well, you're not going to live with it. And trust me, by the way, I've been watching the human race for a very long time, and for significant portions of human history, the human race has gotten along fine without internet. You will not die. I promise you, you will not die if you unplug your internet. You'll be okay. Way better than hell. Way better than hell. Seriously. Okay? Well, Jesus, man, if I have to be honest, the novels I read do kind of feed my dissatisfaction with my marriage and get me to thinking a whole lot about what it'd be like to be with somebody else. Oh, you need to stop reading those books. You need to cut off whatever it is in your life that's just feeding. It's just feeding the lusts in your head. It's feeding the lusts in your heart. I can't do that, Jesus. Click. Kaboom. I'll never forget. I had a good friend in another part of the country who confided in me that he was struggling with feelings for an employee of his who was clearly fishing for a response from him, who was clearly sending signals his direction. And I told him, dude, you've got, and I use this analogy, it's like you've got a can of gas in one hand, you've got a lit match in the other hand, and you're sitting in a hayloft. And I told him this, you need to fire this employee. You need to fire this employee. Oh, I can't do that for this reason, I can't do that for this reason, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And it went there. And by there, I don't mean fire as in termination. I mean fire as in conflagration. Right? And to this day, years later, there is nothing but smoking craters where two families used to be. There is nothing but smoking craters in the lives of children who were at one time thinking that Jesus is the way to go. You hear that? He needed to choose radical severance. So listen to this, just by way of application. If you're getting romantically interested in or emotionally involved with someone you're not married to, Jesus is saying to you this morning in a very loud voice with flashing red lights, cut it off. Radically sever that relationship. Oh, that's just crazy talk. That's just crazy talk. No, says Jesus, selling your soul for a few buzzes and tingles is crazy. Blowing up your family and blowing up someone else's family and blowing up your children and blowing up their faith in me, says Jesus, because you've demonstrated them that doing life my way is a bunch of horse pucky, that's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. And you did it for what? A few moments of buzzes and tingles. That is crazy. The sensible thing, says Jesus. The logical thing. The totally uncrazy thing is to do life my way and choose radical severance. Radically cut off the sources that are feeding the lust in your head. Radically cut off the sources that are feeding the lust in your heart. Radically cutting off the relationships that are trying to drag you across the line to hell. That's the totally logical, uncrazy decision to make. Now, unfortunately, this is just a little pastoral comment here. In every situation that I know of, not one single person is thinking logically with their brains, right? They're not thinking logically. We're not thinking with our brains when we cross that line. But we need to be. We need to be managing our minds and drawing the lines, and radically severing anything that's going to pull us up across the line that God has drawn in the sand. And so, just to wrap this all up, to live, number 7, is God intended, number 7. We need to choose his standards. We need to draw the lines where God draws the lines, in our heads and in our hearts, in our emotions and in our motives, and we need to choose radical severance. We need to radically cut off the sources and the relationships and the technology, whatever it is that keeps feeding the lusts in our heads and in our hearts. All right? That's number 7 this morning, according to Jesus. Now, I want to conclude and just really transition in our time of ministry this morning. And I want to take a moment to speak directly to anyone that might be here who is just, full-on sexually involved with somebody that you're not married to. All right? I don't know who you are, if you're even here. But what I am telling you this morning is what the Lord is telling you need to do. If you want to do life his way, this is what you need to do. And let me also say this. I'm not singling anyone who might fall in that category. I'm not singling you out as if your particular choice of sexual sin is any worse than anybody else's choice of sexual sin. It's all sin. It's all sin. But you are in a particular kind of danger of blowing things up at a way bigger magnitude because of the sin that you're into. We all need to bring our practices. We all need to bring our thought life. We all need to bring our emotions. We all need to bring our motives in alignment with God's standards. But I just want to, specifically address anyone who might be here this morning who is way across that line that I've just described. And this is the pathway that I want to challenge you, the pathway back to purity, the pathway back to God's side of the line that I want to challenge you to choose this morning, okay? Step number 1 is just confess it to God. I am on the wrong side of the line. You need to make that step this morning, confess it. Step 2 is confess it to a trusted friend. If you're a woman, you need to confess it to a woman. If you're a man, you need to confess it to a man. And enroll that person to help you take the next step, which is radically cut off the relationship. Radically sever that relationship. All right? Make sense? Confess it to God, confess it to a friend. Ask them to help you make the hard choice of completely severing that relationship. And step 4 is you need to avoid all contact with that person from now on. Listen to me. You cannot keep a friendship with that person and stay out of bed with them. You will not be able to do it. I've been a pastor 25 some years. I haven't seen one person who could do that yet. You will not be the first. You will not be the first. You need to completely cut off the relationship. Okay? So let's stand together on that lovely note.